there are so many ways of how to solve problems with LLMs out there that initially experimenting more on the macro level is really important because we see some teams really optimize for like a local minimum while not having explored like, different ways to solve things. And trying different agent frameworks or setups or configuration or prompting techniques is really interesting before trying to over optimize whatever you landed on first.
Welcome to Product Side Stories, the podcast where we reveal the very real and raw lessons learned from product leaders and thinkers all over the world. I'm your host, Rina Alexin, CEO of Product Side. Let's dive into today's episode. And today I'm joined by Marc Klingen, the co-founder of Langfuse, a Y Combinator company focused on being an open source LLM engineering platform. Marc, welcome.
Thanks so much, Rina, for the invitation.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you today because I know a lot of our listeners, product managers, are being asked to do a lot with their products, to introduce AI into their products. But you and I know that it's not about creating the world's next chatbot, right? So first, I'd love to get a little bit of background for our audience on what is Langfuse? Why did you get started?
Yeah, together with my two co-founders, while in Y Combinator, we built a number of LM-based products, and every time hit the problem of that it's like really, really difficult to understand how these more complex applications actually work under the hood if it's not just a chatbot, and how to then continuously measure and improve them, which for us was really important as we were pre-product market fit and wanted to sell something and it shouldn't break when people use it. But for many more like established teams, enterprise teams, it's really important to then convince the internal stakeholders that the application works well. So the problems align, and basically we pivoted into from building LM-based applications into the suite of developer tools that Langfuse is today. And we help thousands of teams globally, both startups and enterprises, to ship working LM products faster. So happy to go deep on this.
Great. And so who do you typically, so what's your typical customer base? So I know you mentioned a couple different types of customers, but who do you really work with?
Yeah. Mostly we are first adopted by the engineering side of the teams, because these usually face the challenges of wanting to monitor cost, needing to understand how the product works. And then also they are the ones who instrument and integrate with Langfuse. So naturally we first worked with them, but over time, more and more product managers, domain experts, leadership gets involved, because like the tracking of metrics is really interesting to leadership, and then iterating on prompts and use case and understanding user feedback is really interesting for the product managers that are involved in these projects.
You know, you just started off mentioning something that I hear often with product managers is that they don't really have a good handle on understanding once they add AI to their product, how much is that going to cost the company? And I think that a lot of, I would say for business case building, they get asked a lot of those questions. So is that true? Is that really a challenge for product managers or product teams of understanding what is the cost of their solution?
I think that predicting it is a very common problem, as the prediction kind of depends on use case, context, has like a high variance generally. But I think an important thing to keep in mind is that for many of these use cases, cost per use really is not that much of a problem if the use case itself is valuable, especially in B2B. As generally just like the contract sizes are large enough that a couple of cents spent on each LM call don't really matter. But cost changes a lot. So many of our users track how cost develops over time, how with new model generation cost decreases. And then as a use case scales, there are like so many ways to improve on costs. Teams fine-tune smaller models, usually called like model distillation, to improve costs. Or you can do a lot of like prompt optimization and more on the fine-tuning side. There are like so many ways to improve cost once a use case moves to production. So that's like really a big concern usually for especially large organizations.
Yeah, I could not agree with you more, Marc, because we often talk about AI as part of a solution. It's not really going to invent the problem. So what you're saying right now of finding the right, most valuable use case really resonates with me. So then let's talk about that. Oftentimes it's like, what problem are you solving? And AI, does it solve that problem better, faster, cheaper, et cetera, right? Like that's how you should be approaching it. So how do you, for example, help product managers identify the right use cases that could be valuable?
Yeah, I think there are like two conceptual probably stages of how people structure this problem, where one is kind of like the use case selection and then the mapping of some sort of acceptance criteria on these use cases while developing them and moving to production. On the selection of use cases level, I think this is a very conceptual problem where software doesn't really help, but PMs and leadership generally needs to understand that there's some risk and some return usually attached to many of these use cases where like a high enough return either for users or for the bottom line with regards to costs is super important for internal sponsorship of these projects, because if have like some sort of high risk or brand risk attached to it, there needs to be some sort of champion that drives them, as otherwise they can be blocked by so many people internally where people just feel uneasy about it might reflecting negatively on a brand. That's at least what we see especially in large organizations. So this kind of risk and like return trade-off is really important. But then as a team start working on a project, like prioritization based on like quality, cost, latency, and setting like strict requirements on what should be delivered is really important. And compared to like other features that PMs might work on, it's really difficult to get the requirements right, because in the end, many of these features have like an open-ended text input box. If it's like a more chatty user-facing application, and users could do anything with it, it feels kind of magical. Then you add like a magic icon to it, and then users expect even more. And I don't know, you just intended to build a chart generator for revenue metrics, but people ask about other metrics and they don't work. So kind of knowing what the user wants ahead of time is really difficult. And then like improving on this over time is also really difficult. So I think the kind of like setting the boundaries of what should be well supported and guiding the user in the right direction is key for these kind of open-ended user-facing use cases.
Yeah, I see. It's almost like even though you might predict a certain way a user might use that interface, if they start using it in ways it was not designed to be built, you then run the risk of it still doing something for the user, but then not really having that level of quality, obviously. So, is that what you mean by brand risk related to implementing this technology?
This is more like the kind of like security risks around
Mm,
hallucinated responses. If, for example, in highly regulated domains, we see many teams that we work with being very conscious about hallucination rates if they, for example, provide like answers based on legal text and just don't want to ever respond anything if it's not grounded in some sort of source. But it's very easy if you pick a big model that you get like a hallucinated response that just sounds good, and they're adding the right guardrails and then evaluating after the fact whether like what the prevalence of these problems is really important. And that's what we also with Langfuse mostly focus on the kind of like evaluation of quality and these kind of security risks.
So at Langfuse, you're helping make those security risks visible to your users. That's what I'm understanding. How do you do that? What kind of metrics do you track? What are the most common ones that are useful for product people?
Yeah. Zoomed out, we generally give visibility into what's happening step by step in these applications as they get more complicated, and then extract three big groups of metrics: cost, quality, and latency. And where quality can again be broken down, and where especially PMs need to get this right for the use case, where usually there's some kind of like implicit or explicit user feedback that can be picked up in
Mm,
production, to then understand whether the application actually works. Especially the implicit user feedback designing for these loops is really key. So, for example, if you build a customer success application and you suggest some sort of response to a user and you still have an agent in the loop, if the agent doesn't edit the text and just hit send, then that's probably like good feedback. Whereas if it's heavily edited, it's negative feedback. So these kind of like implicit feedback loops and tracking them is key to then drive the application forward and improve it over time and learn from what's happening in prod. Then second is more like bringing domain experts on and labeling data manually. While many teams directly want to move to automated evals, usually some sort of manual annotation labeling is important to have some baseline to understand, okay, this is how we actually want to evaluate whether things are risky or good. And finally, there are usually different ways to scale out these kinds of evaluations and risk assessments to basically take the manually labeled data as some sort of like labeled data set and some grounded truth, and then you try to approximate it, for example, with LM as a judge, where you use just another LLM and
mhm.
prompt it. For example, you have this response, you have this context of legal documents. Like, is this response grounded in the documents that we provided to you? Or did it like hallucinate new facts that are not included in the legal text? So it's like there are tons of different libraries out there, but usually without a baseline, it's really difficult to build trust in them because in the end, people then just assume, okay, it's just another LLM that makes up a score, and there needs some kind of like boundaries and guardrails again to understand whether they actually work. So yeah, these are like quality, cost, latency, and then broken down like quality into manual labeling, automated evals, implicit user feedback, and explicit user feedback.
Mark, do you envision a future where there's just going to be I want to say like a group of different LLMs with different use cases that they're responsible for? So every single LLM that would be built will have a LLM that's just judging the quality of that LLM. And then they're just talking to each other, essentially like a group of agents.
Yeah, some people are really excited about it, and I think it's interesting. This notebook use case by Google is really cool. Or there are some really interesting applications where you just use LMs and how they discuss with each other. Um, I think over the last years, we see more and more large models come out that then teams adapt more via like in-context learning, meaning prompting them smartly and using context smartly, and then fine-tuning them. But also, for example, Mistral releases increasingly fine-tuned models or specific small models for specific application domain. And generally, many larger teams fine-tune their own models with like their specific tone of voice, for example. So I think we'll move to more specialized fine-tuned models over time, if they are like groups of use cases. So, for example, we chatted with a team that just focuses on models for biology use cases and like predicting how like cell configurations work. And under the hood, it's the same technology. It's also transformers, but it's like adapted for this kind of niche. And I think we'll increasingly see more of these niche models.
Yeah, I am seeing, and I have talked to other AI leaders. Like I recently had a conversation with someone who is using AI to do predictive, it's like predictive analytics based on people's demographic data to understand who has more of a risk for certain disease types. So I just think that, yeah, this technology, especially in healthcare, is going to be fascinating what we can do with it. But you did mention something that I want to dig into. So a lot of companies, they are trying to build their own version of an LLM. But a lot of them are also coming up with the difficulty of how fast the technology is changing. So the second that they build something, let's say it was built on the ChatGPT 3.5 model, and now the 4.0 came out, and the next one's going to come out soon. So how does a company deal with the fast changing technology? They're building something, but then once it's out the door, it's almost obsolete.
Yeah, I think you can see this as a risk, or it's kind of like a big upside of building in this space, as basically your product gets better automatically and cheaper and faster. Just like every 6 months, you can basically just adopt a new model generation, and thereby, if you have the right workflow in place, very quickly profit from these developments. And generally, we see that there are some ways to help your organization to move fast on adopting these new waves of models, where it's for one, usually like using some sort of abstraction that you're not like being too much locked into a single model vendor. So if you can centrally abstract how your application interfaces with models, you can then more quickly switch and experiment with different model providers, which is usually like an architecture decision which makes sense to make early on. And then second, it's about like having these kind of like evaluations in place and being able to monitor how your application works in production, because then you can, when something new comes out, think about how you can integrate this into your application, then quickly test what the impact would be, to move this kind of change to production very quickly, without worrying that it might break something, or at least being able to measure how it breaks things. As generally model upgrades make things better and cheaper, so you want to be able to move to production quickly with them. You asked like what not to over-index on because it might become obsolete in like 6 months. I think it's Sam Altman had like an interesting quote around like you shouldn't over-index on working around models like missing capabilities today, but rather focus on what they are good at. So if a use case seems to work a lot around a current limitation, for example, like context length or generic reasoning, then maybe spending now a year of research on it doesn't make that much sense because it's a generic problem. But if your problem is very specific to your use case, it seems to be very relevant to index on it and go deep, because then with every model release, you can transfer whatever you did for your use case to the new model version. But if you try to like build generic abilities that would also make sense for like dozens of other teams, then probably on the model layer, like innovations will render them kind of redundant.
So, Mark, I think this goes hand in hand with what you're saying about seeing more niche types of products come out, because it looks like if it's a general problem, that's going to be solved by the ones building the models. And so everyone then will stand to benefit from that. So, you doing it on your own probably is a waste of time. That's what I'm hearing you. But then that also lends itself to if you are a niche, like if you're focused on a very niche part of the market, you might actually be producing or focusing on a problem that these players will not be focused on. And so you'll be able to create much more value for that segment.
Yes. And I think they're the kind of like increasing loop of launching your product in this segment, learning from production what works, then continuously fine-tuning models for your niche or optimizing your prompting techniques or general architecture for this niche is extremely relevant, and where I think your like stated kind of like potential fear of being disrupted by changes on the model layer are less. I haven't seen this happen too often where teams feel like, oh, if we started new, we could rip out like half of what we've built. So generally, like if you optimize for your specific problem, then usually every new model release is really helpful.
So you also mentioned that there are some, I would say, missteps in implementation. So you can make a misstep on focusing on the wrong thing, focusing on wrong use case, and it sounds like not thinking through how you're going to get those feedback loops. Are there any common other missteps that you're seeing a lot of teams take?
We already talked on like about the like problem selection and then basically how to set up the acceptance criteria or some kind of like benchmarking levels of where the organization feels comfortable to move to prod and where you have buy-in to move to production. I think beyond that, when then starting developing the first prototype or use case, there are so many ways of how to solve problems with LLMs out there that initially experimenting more on the macro level is really important, because we see some teams really optimize for like a local minimum while not having explored like different ways to solve things. And there are like great libraries out there that help you understand how things could be solved from a technical perspective. And trying different agent frameworks or setups or configuration or prompting techniques is really interesting before trying to over optimize whatever you landed on first. So this would be, I think, one. And second, especially if it's like a PM-driven project in a large organization, we usually see teams go faster if they decouple the prompt engineering from the actual like software engineering. And for example, use some sort of prompt engineering or prompt management tool to then decouple the two things, because then you can define like interfaces of which kinds of prompts or steps do we have in our application, and then domain experts can help iterate on them and then evaluate them. Use like in the best case in software, so they don't need to involve engineering to move on prompts quickly, while basically using evaluations to directly know whether things improve or not on data sets of test items. And then also being able to just release prompt iterations quickly without having to wait for engineering to do a next release. So thereby just decoupling software from like the prompt engineering side.
So you're saying that product managers can, I think, get a lot more done if they are very well versed in prompt engineering. You mentioned a tool. Is there a tool that you would recommend a product manager to look into for this?
Generally, there are many. Langfuse also supports this workflow, and we have like an open source prompt management tool out there as part of our overall suite of tools. But yeah, there are many out there. Many teams build it themselves, but then usually face the issue of that if you pull prompts out of an application and need to fetch them from somewhere, that this adds additional latency. And you usually want the prompts to be available immediately, especially in these kind of like real-time applications. So yeah, like tools optimized for this, so it's better to pick a tool.
What else do you think product managers may get wrong about LLMs?
I think early on, many teams focus on quality a lot because this seems to be so difficult to get right. But then when we talk with the PMs and startup founders where the use case scales a lot, many of them worry a whole lot about latency, because users, when they wait, they get frustrated. So optimizing for either having a very fast initial token, because if it's like streaming, then just seeing the first response token very quickly is really important. And there are ways to optimize on this. And second, if you know that it will take longer, then optimizing this kind of loading, waiting experience of what's happening here, like to keep the user kind of like eagerly waiting while confirming like something is happening is really important. So many have built like nice loading animations. If they generate charts that you see like this kind of skeleton chart already, or just like pre-generate already the title while the rest of the chart is still coming. So thinking about the kind of what to show to a user while the user is waiting, or how to cut down on latency.
That's interesting for me, and I've also seen that in practice, especially when it does sometimes take these models some time. But I've seen different brands have fun with it, and I think that actually helps solve some of that problem. So you're right. So be creative about that problem and use it for your brand. All right. So what advice can you share if think about product managers who are just looking to get started with AI and LLMs? What should they do first?
Yeah. If like there are a couple of things. I summarized some like interesting reading points on like a subpath on our website. So langfuse.com/library. Just like good readings on how to architect this kind of process of developing an LLM-based application. Many of these kind of resources aren't by myself, but it's just like good articles I found that I really like, that I reference like articles on how to basically architect this process. I think next, like going deep on how to prompt well is interesting. I mean, you can go too deep on it, but learnprompting.org is like a good starting point with some sort of like, I think it puts like a topology out there for how to think about prompting and what kind of ways are there and how do they work. And for me personally, it's just like playing around with many LM-based products to see how the UX actually works, and how to get the user excited about it. Because there's some like death spot of, for example, generating a whole lot of potentially crappy output. So I think there's like a space of it's probably bad, but it's quick. So it's kind of like it keeps me in flow. But if I need to wait for it, it needs to be better. Just like I think exposing yourself to many of these AI-based products then helps to get like some kind of like taste for it, of how to get it right.
Yeah, Mark, I think I saw the other day someone had created a video with their, I don't know, 7 or 9-year-old daughter creating a chat for Harry Potter using ChatGPT to help with the code base. It was insane. But yeah, I agree with you. Best place to get started is to look into resources. There are plenty of resources out there. Product side, of course, also we have our AI product management course, and start playing with it. I know a lot of people who are a little wary about the technology, but when you start using it, it becomes less scary and more empowering, because you can do so much with it. Well,
Yeah,
Mark,
maybe to add to this, like there are many very good libraries that put out a lot of example code, and many of my friends who were originally like non-technical, just via basically ChatGPT and Cursor, for example, just get into like programming a little bit as well, where then like trying these example applications and hacking on them is like something someone get easy. I think it was never easier to get into it than ever before, because you basically have some sort of expert on your side to answer questions of what's actually happening. So I guess trying to build something yourself, even if you're not technical, could be cool to get like closer to the technology and understanding what's happening.
yeah, and it's for some reason, I don't know about you, but it feels fun to do it. So it's like you're learning, but you're enjoying it too. So definitely agree. Well, Mark, how can people find you after this episode has aired?
Generally on Twitter and LinkedIn, just like my full name. And we do put out a lot of content via our Langfuse accounts as well. But probably LinkedIn and Twitter is the best ways.
Wonderful. And everyone, thank you so much for tuning into Product Side Stories. Please check out langfuse.com. They do have, I can qualify, they have great resources. I learned a lot just from checking out your blog. So thank you so much for putting that out for the community. And again, thank you for joining our episode today. I hope today's insights inspire you and propel your product journey forward. Remember, every challenge is a lesson waiting to be learned. Visit us at productside.com for more free resources, including webinars, templates, playbooks, and other product wisdom repackaged for you. I'm Rina Alexin, and until next time, keep innovating, keep leading, and keep creating stories worth sharing.